Welcome everyone. Thanks so much for joining. We're just waiting a couple of moments for everyone to connect and then we'll get started very shortly. Thank you. Welcome. Thanks for joining. We're just waiting a couple of moments and then we'll get started shortly. So, hello everyone, and on behalf of the Oxford Migration Studies Society, welcome to the last event of our annual conference under the theme of Borders and Justice. Today's panel will speak to different phases of resistance, such as legal responses, struggle against immigration, detention, a right to the city, and a more philosophical outlook on a new Declaration of Citizenship. My name is Sarah. I'm OMSS co-president together with Bella, whom you'll hear from at the end, and thank you so much for coming to this last event. I just wanted to take a moment to flag some logistics before introducing the others on your screen. So after the panelists present, there will be a Q&A session. Please feel free to type questions into the Q&A box as you think of them, with the name of whoever the question is directed to, if that's applicable. You'll also have the choice to upvote and comment on each other's questions. Now I'd like to introduce the chair, Professor Naomi Paik. We're really glad to have her chair the session. I personally have most recently encountered her work on Haitian refugees, the US state and precedents for the global border regime, and I've really enjoyed it. Professor Naomi Paik is the author of Bans, Walls, Raids, Sanctuary, Understanding US Immigration for the 21st Century, and Rightlessness, Testimony and Redress in US Prison Camps since World War II, as well as articles, opinion pieces, and interviews in a range of academic and public-facing venues. She co-edited 3 special issues of the Radical History Review, Militarism and Capitalism in winter 2019, Radical Histories of Sanctuary in fall 2019, and Policing, Justice and the Radical Imagination in spring 2020. Professor Paik also co-edits the Borderlands section of public books. She is an associate professor of criminology, law and justice, and global Asian studies at the University of Illinois, Chicago. Thank you so much everyone for being here, and I will take Professor Paik from here. Enjoy the session.
Hey, hello, everyone. Welcome, and thank you so much for joining us this evening or morning, wherever you are in the world. It's my pleasure to chair this panel on current resistance and future alternatives. So what I'm going to do is introduce each of the speakers right before they present their own paper, and then I'll also be moderating the Q&A. I encourage you to post questions through the Q&A function at any time. Okay, so we're going to start with a paper called Resistance in Response to Australian Immigration Detention, Lessons Learned After 3 Decades of Advocacy. And this paper is written by Erika Kalocsányiová and Ryan Essex. So Dr. Ryan Essex is a research fellow with the Institute for Life Course Development, the University of Greenwich. He is interested in migration and health and the health of those detained in immigration detention centers. He is also interested in how the healthcare community can be effective advocates in response to these issues. Dr. Erika Kalocsányiová is a research fellow with the Institute for Life Course Development at the University of Greenwich. Her research focuses primarily on the integration processes and outcomes of displaced and refugee communities. She also has an ongoing interest in the health and mental health impacts of immigration detention. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Shall I just share? Here we go.
Yeah, good afternoon to everyone, and thank you for the kind introduction, Naomi. We are absolutely thrilled with Ryan to be here today as part of this panel and conference. As said, my name is Erika Kalocsányiová, and I'm a research fellow with the Institute for Life Course Development at the University of Greenwich. And together with Ryan, we are going to briefly discuss the recent history of advocacy and activism in response to Australian immigration detention. You can go to the next slide, Ryan. So I will start this presentation by giving you a broad overview of the context and of the devastating consequences that immigration detention has had for those who are trying to reach Australia. And then Ryan, in the second part of the presentation, is going to talk about the actions of lawyers, doctors, and the general public in demanding change, along with the lessons that we can learn from their actions and resistance. Over the past 30 years, Australia has implemented increasingly harsh measures to deter people from seeking asylum and refuge in the country. And among them was a policy of mandatory immigration detention. In 2013, Australia also reintroduced offshore detention centers on Manus Island and Nauru, often forcefully transferring boat arrivals from Australian territories into these offshore centers. And once detained there, people were not given an opportunity to be resettled in Australia and were left in a complete legal limbo. Many of them are still waiting for an acceptable resettlement option, and hundreds have been detained for over 8 or even more years now. We also believe it's important to emphasize that while anybody without a valid visa can be detained in Australia, the most punitive elements of these policies were actually geared toward deterring future boat arrivals. So if I can again move to the next slide, please, Ryan. Now, since their opening, the offshore centers on Manus Island and Nauru have witnessed multiple riots, violence, sexual and physical abuse, as well as self-harm and suicides. So this, of course, has raised concerns about the health and well-being of the people in these offshore centers, both in the Australian community, but also internationally. Australia's detention policies have been recognized as uniquely cruel and draconian. They were described as inhumane and degrading treatment by the International Criminal Court, and they were even likened to abuse and torture by many. But despite all the resistance and opposition, both domestically and internationally, the Australian government has long rejected any constructive attempts to reform this system. And here I would like to invite you to read the quotes from the former Prime Minister and the former Minister of Home Affairs, while I'll pass the word on to Ryan, who will talk you about the opposition, activism and advocacy that Australia's immigration policies triggered over the last years.
Thank you, Erika, and thank you everybody here. It's wonderful to have you here and actually start to present on some of my work that I've been thinking about for the last, I guess, decade. So what I'm primarily interested in is how we begin to use theory and evidence to support our actions, ultimately looking at reform and then abolition of these sort of restrictive migration controls. Quite obviously, the government in Australia hasn't come to the table, not interested in any sort of constructive efforts to reform the system. So quite unsurprisingly, a lot of people haven't taken that lying down. A lot of people have taken to the street, essentially, and done many other things. So I think today I'm going to go over some of these lessons. There are, of course, many more, and some that are generalizable and others that are not. But I'll go over some ones that I think are quite key. So the first is that different actions have different impacts, and persistent protest in Australia has been quite effective at keeping these issues in the headlines and maintaining that sort of support. But where we often see the biggest shifts in policy is when we sort of exploit an opportunity, and that is, exposing a weakness in policy, a loophole, or leveraging some kind of strength or advantage. So the Medivac legislation is a really good example of this. So in 2019, the Prime Minister stepped down. There was a leadership challenge, and in his place, an independent candidate was elected. And this was enough to tip the balance of power in Australian Parliament. And they passed a law, which became known as the Medivac Legislation, which gave doctors greater power to bring unwell asylum seekers to Australia. Of course, one of the downsides of this, and one of the downsides of many of these sort of opportunistic, ways of acting, is that it's often shut down quite quickly. So the Australian government shut this down within a couple of months before that legislation was repealed. Perhaps another important lesson is that you can't do it all on your own. And for many involved in this space already, I think some of this you might already know, but I think it's something that's quite important to emphasize. So, and not just individual partnerships. Beyond that, we need coalitions, and we're all going to have different opinions and tactics and goals, but often we have more similarities than differences. So in Australia, there's been a long-standing collaboration between doctors and lawyers, both working pro bono to get people out of detention, challenge these matters in court. And, you know, prior to Medivac passing, the legislation I was just talking about, many refugee organisations came together, sensing that there was a real opportunity to push for positive change. For those of you who have also been at this for a while, you know, you probably at times will inevitably despair and feel quite hopeless. And in some cases, it might seem that your actions aren't having a great impact. But there's a really lovely sort of literature here, and this really lovely idea of everyday resistance. You can resist every day, even in small day-to-day acts. And it's a lovely thing, just by challenging discourse, challenging truths, what others think they know. These little acts of resistance, it takes time, it takes repetition, and again, it can be frustrating, but you know, over time, these things can really make a difference. Look, if you're going to sort of engage in this sort of action, be prepared for blowback. You know, it does come with some risks. It sort of seems in Australia, the more punitive the policy, the more the government had to hide, the more sensitive they became to criticism, and they attacked everybody who was sort of prominent on the issue. But in saying that, you can also turn that sort of thing to your advantage. So, for example, the Australian Human Rights Commission authored a report, the Forgotten Children report. Essentially, it didn't say much that was new. It said that detention harms children. But because of the government's response to it, it put this report in the headlines, and it put, you know, these issues, you know, in the papers, online, and the government, there was a response against it. And as a result, in 2015, all children were removed from onshore detention centres because of that pressure. It took quite some time. You know, so with all of this pressure, with decades of action, we can count some small victories. At present, there are over 1,000 people who are in Australia who were from offshore centres. They have been transferred since 2013 for medical reasons. A couple of hundred were transferred under the Medivac legislation that I was talking about. And you know, these changes, these small victories can't be counted because the government has had a change of heart. The government are still horrible about these issues. They've come about because of pressure, because of people leveraging, you know, these sort of powers and exploiting these opportunities I was talking about. In saying that, we should temper, you know, any sort of pats on the back and these small victories, because, you know, the core of Australia's policies remain. They passed some new horrible legislation the other day. And obviously, broadly, globally, millions remain displaced. So I think it's going to be down to us, down to everybody here, and we need a global response, because quite clearly states have failed in this regard. So look, we're going to be around for questions, and we really look forward to questions. Our email addresses are there if anybody would like to email. We're happy to chat. And there's also a cheeky plug for my book, which I've been absolutely horrible at promoting, but here it is now. And thank you very much again for having us.
Thank you so much, Erika and Ryan. Okay, so next we have Caroline Tracey and her paper is named Return Migration, Emplacement, and the Right to the City. Caroline Tracey is a writer and geography PhD candidate at the University of California at Berkeley. Her research about women and transgender deportees and returned migrants in Mexico City has been supported by a Werner Glenn dissertation fieldwork grant and a Women's Studies Award from the Institute for Citizens and Scholars. Her academic articles appear in the Journal of the Southwest and are forthcoming from the Journal of Latino and Latin American Studies and the Burlington Contemporary. You can find her non-academic writing in N+1, SF MoMA's Open Space, The Guardian, and in Spanish in Nexos. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks you all for being here. This talk is going to be a short introduction to my research with specifically women in the returned migrant community in Mexico City, and making kind of a small argument, because it's only 10 minutes, about the way that methodology interacts with content in this research. So I'm going to start with a quotation that I read in a transnational feminism course at UC Berkeley that I took during my first semester of graduate school, and that really sort of fundamentally shaped the way that I approached my studies. It's a quote from a 1994 essay by James Clifford that reads, quote, "Diaspora is always gendered. When diasporic experience is viewed in terms of displacement rather than emplacement, traveling rather than dwelling, the experiences of men will tend to predominate." And so I argue that this maxim holds true for the so-called deportspora of individuals that are deported from the United States to Mexico, as well as for the broader community of returned migrants. So individuals that were not deported, but many of whom returned under circumstances of obligation other than deportation, such as the deportation of a family member, fear of deportation, or lack of work or educational opportunities. It's now well known in academic migration circles in the US that while Mexico was long a migrant sending country, it's now becoming one of reception and return. Between 2010 and 2018, 2.6 million Mexicans left the United States, slightly over half of which, 55%, left by deportation. And now there's a net outflow, actually, rather than a net inflow of migrants from Mexico to the US. And these flows, and I think particularly the presence of women in them, are consequences of US immigration and enforcement regimes over the course of the 20th century, which have gradually, over the last few decades, created a permanent undocumented class, or at least a long-term undocumented class that really didn't exist in previous decades in the 20th century, and in which the threat of deportation looms increasingly large as policies continue to become more restrictive. And existing literature about deportation has effectively overlooked women as part of the deportee community, emphasizing the fact that over 90% of deportees are men. Meanwhile, there's very little existing literature from US American scholars about return migration to Mexico. There's quite a bit now from Mexico, but much less from the US. And women make up a larger percentage of returned migrants, something between 20 and 30%, according to Mexican census data. And so one, for instance, particularly influential voice in deportation studies, Tanya Golas-Boza, I think has made arguments that inadvertently contributed to the invisibilization of female deportees. Her book argues that the 1996 Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act, or IRA, which is the law that has vastly increased deportations from the United States, has had a gendered effect. Right. She writes, quote, "The number of female deportees has remained steady since 1998, whereas the number of male deportees has continued to increase. Over time, the 1996 laws have had a disproportionate effect on men, with making up nearly 90% of removals in recent years." So this is striking, given that women make up about half of all non-citizens in the US. And then in a further paper, Golas-Boza and Pierrette Ondagno-Sotelo argued that deportation was, quote, "a gendered racial removal program." So effectively that the deportation was a means to remove workers that are considered excess under neoliberal capitalism, and that those workers are specifically male, that male labor is sort of more the surplus labor at this moment in time. And so I think in these arguments, tacitly women deportees become essentially kind of collateral damage. And so I think that this invisibilization of women deportees and then also return migrants who sort of are doubly invisibilized by the fact that there's very little scholarship about return migrants gets repeated in other papers about deportation. So time and time again, I've found that in papers about deportation, the method section states that because there are so few women deportees, it was too hard to find women to interview, or that their perspectives were useful, but it was really focused on men because there were many more men. And I think that this method's sort of argument for a lack of a focus on women also is a effect of the fact that the data tends to be collected in brief and one-time interviews. So to use Clifford's words again, a lot of studies about deportation are focused on displacement, the causes of deportation and the experience of the act of deportation, rather than on the process of emplacement. And my research using ethnographic methods sort of flips that script, showing that women deportees and return migrants are anything but ancillary to the processes of emplacement. They carry out really important community building and activism that improve the experiences of women deportees, as well as the whole have effects across the whole return migrant and deportee community. So, and I think, you know, speaking sort of more personally, when I first started doing this research, I realized as I was working that I was going to focus on women, but I struggled to justify that decision. Even coming from a theoretical background of transnational feminism, I felt like I had to justify that women were somehow inherently interesting or something like this. And I think I realized eventually that this nexus of the way that gender, method, and emplacement come together is precisely this significant, that using ethnography, defined, you know, in its most basic form as slow and in-depth and observant research, to study deportation, brought women to the forefront and added a new dimension to the study of deportation that I wasn't seeing in the literature. So instead of being focused on the event itself, which I also have periodically wondered the relationship of studies that ask deportees directly about the event of deportation to IRB protocols, because I felt like one of the things I had to demonstrate in going through the IRB process was that I was not going to ask directly about trauma. And the more time I spent with deportees and return migrants, I think that it is considered a trauma. And so I as sort of a secondary note, I sort of have started to wonder about how those studies relate to ethical research. But I think that conducting ethnography with the women of deportation has involved watching how lives and activism unfold over a much longer term period in Mexico, and rather than just focusing on the actual event of deportation or return. And so these processes of emplacement unfold at multiple scales. In one chapter of my dissertation, oh, sorry, I just saw this 2-minute mark. Is this for me or is it for someone else?
You have about 2 minutes remaining, yes.
Wow, it's so quick. Okay, then I'm just going to briefly say that the process of emplacement that I think that I've been studying that I think are quite interesting unfold at multiple scales. One way in which they unfold is that women deportees have really led a lot of activism to become intimately familiar with the Mexican bureaucracy, and in fact put pressure on the Mexican government to change policies in ways that benefit especially US-born children, but also other deportees and return migrants. A second scale at which emplacement happens is through translocal community building. So by sort of claiming a right to the city for return migrants, and then expanding community building to include the senses of home that migrants have, from where migrants are returning. And then I think a third scale at which emplacement and activism gets enacted by women deportees and returnees is in activism that is not directly in the service of the deportee and returnee community, but intersects with it. So for instance, there are examples of deportees and return migrants that are involved in trans activism, in which they are bringing skills from the US and applying them in the service of other fights in in Mexico. And I haven't observed, but I've been told of similar cases in Central America, and others who are deportees who were deported during the asylum process, who have begun to organize once on the ground again in Mexico to demand indemnifications on behalf of victims of violence in Mexico, in a way that I think is sort of using a binational perspective to force or to demand that the Mexican government reconceptualize what is the significance of being a victim of organized crime, what is the significance of the war on drugs, and what is the significance of the country's ongoing militarization. And so while these veins of activism aren't directly in the service of the deportee and returnee community, they are also processes of emplacement through activism that intersect with the community in significant ways. So I think I'm out of time. Just to wrap up, the paper, I think, argues for the importance of gender perspectives and ethnography in the study of migration, showing that they reciprocally reveal each other's importance and illuminate previously overlooked dimensions in the study of migration. And yeah, thank you all for your time and listening.
Okay, thank you so much. That was such a great paper. I'm really looking forward to, I'm getting more and more excited for the discussion period. So thank you so much. Okay, so next we have Hanaa Hakiki, whose paper is entitled Impunity Perpetuated: Obstacles to Accountability and Justice at the Border. So Hanaa Hakiki works as a senior legal advisor at ECCHR, a lawyers NGO which addresses grave human rights violations through transnational legal interventions. Her work focuses on border rights since 2014, with a focus on litigating pushbacks at EU's external borders in front of international courts. In 2011, she qualified as a lawyer or solicitor in England, where she has specialized in litigating state violence, detention, and institutional racism. Thank you so much.
Hello, and thank you for the invitation. I have a presentation that I'll just share with you. And I think I have. Yes, so I've changed slightly the title of my presentation. Pushback litigation, a tool of resistance. The question mark comes from the fact that law is generally a tool of power, so a tool of oppression, and therefore I kind of kept the question mark. So I'll first start with a definition of pushbacks. I'll go quickly because I've realized it's too long, but I'm sure it'll be fine. It's going to be very visual. And then I'll do a quick chronology of pushbacks and speak about what we're dealing with nowadays, which is that the reality of pushbacks is simply denied, and which allows impunity to be perpetrated. And then I'll go back to that question: can law be a tool of resistance? So the definition of pushbacks that we work with is a set of state measures by which refugees and migrants, or rather those who are perceived as refugees and migrants, and there's a racial profiling process in pushbacks, are forced over a border without consideration of their individual circumstances and without any possibility to apply for asylum or to put forward any arguments against their expulsion. So doing a chronology from when we started working on that issue to now, what we've seen is that when we started, basically, we started working on Spain, and it was sort of an exceptional country that did pushbacks openly. At the time, I don't think the term pushback even existed in 2014. But by now, they've become sort of a systemic practice. So coming back to where they happened in Spain was in the Spanish enclaves of Ceuta and Melilla that are on the Moroccan coast. Because in 2014, fences were put around the enclaves. They look like this when you look closer. Blue is Morocco and red is Spain. And I have a warning because images are a bit violent. This is how pushbacks happen. So you had the Guardia Civil coming up on the fences and basically beating people down the fence and then walking or carrying them back through. And then, sorry, and NDNNT is the first case that we supported. And I'll go back to that. And the way that Spain justified pushbacks, I go back to this, was that it had this concept of the chewing gum border, which allowed them to say, well, you haven't really entered. So basically the border is where the Spanish flag is, but they said, no, it's a bit further. And in the border zone, basically law doesn't apply because we need it not to. Yeah, so that was, and the reason why I'm still coming back to that is that I think that argument is still being used nowadays by a number of states, which will, they will use other concepts, such as the concept of non-admission, or arguing that there has been a non-entry because no legal entry was granted. And so people are not really in the territory where in fact they are, and they should be protected by the law. The case of NDNNT is the first case that we supported, and in which the European Court of Human Rights, in fact, confirmed that you couldn't create a border zone where the law would not apply, even though the court also created a loophole for the law to actually not apply. But I'll come back to that at the end. And also hence the question mark as law as a tool of resistance. So if we fast forward to 2015 and what was called the refugee crisis, even though it wasn't a crisis, borders were relatively open. It was relatively safe to get through until they actually got closed again. And so people kept moving because people always keep moving, but the borders were closed. And of course, with that, I mean, if you decide to close borders, people will still keep moving. And the question is, what do you do with them? So what was done is that they were pushed back. And by 2020, pushbacks are happening everywhere in Europe. And they're really a systemic practice of EU border control. And this map is not from me, it's from the EU Fundamental Rights Agency. So it is really a problem, a European-wide problem. And I've taken the Croatian example to talk about what we're facing nowadays. So when in Spain, pushbacks were happening at the border in front of everyone that was around, in Croatia and in other countries, they happen in the forests, in the hills, in smaller groups, away from witnesses and journalists. And the way, so because pushbacks are unlawful and they are inhuman and they are immoral, what governments are doing, what Croatia has been doing for years, what Greece is doing now, is to simply deny that they occur, even though there's overwhelming evidence that they do occur. So by now, I think anyone one can think of has been reporting about pushbacks, including, I mean, I've just put the Council of Europe there to have a visual, but it's actually the Commissioner for Human Rights of the Council of Europe and the Parliament of the Council of Europe and the representative for migrants' rights. On the UN level, it's also the Special Rapporteur for the Rights of Migrants and the Special Rapporteur on Torture, and United Nations Bosnia-Herzegovina and UNHCR. But basically, Croatia keeps saying that it's not true and that it did not happen. And that all of these reports are only based on testimonies by migrants and that all of these migrants are simply lying. Of course, that's also not true because all of these organizations have quite clear fact-finding and fact verification methodologies, but also because those testimonies are accompanied by pictures of injuries and medical reports, and also because we've had testimonies by others, such as whistleblowers within the Croatian police forces, but also Bosnian officials and Serbian officials. But yet journalists and activists have been trying to get sort of more proof, and they have. So first, The Guardian published a footage, just again, sorry for the images. The reason they're there is because they are an intrinsic part of our problematic, which is how do we prove what is already proven? So the image before the bloody image was the first footage that came of migrants and refugees after they were beaten up by Croatian officers. And then the second footage that came was published by the Border Violence Monitoring Network. There was a hidden camera for 20 days next to like the border, and it took 20 days of just pushbacks it kind of showed how widespread they were actually, because it's just one location and there were so many of them. But still the government kept saying that it was all lies, whilst also saying, well, these are not refugees, these are just migrants. They cannot be refugees because if you've crossed many borders, you can't claim asylum anymore, or if you've entered unlawfully, you cannot claim asylum, which is all not true legally. And then still journalists tried to get more evidence. So one of them did a piece where she filmed, you can see sort of the Croatian police vans going to the border, which is the white wall there. And then you see the policeman sort of raising his hand and telling people to get off to go to the Bosnian side. Still, that was still denied. And then lately there was, again, the pictures are violent. There was one further coverage basically showing torture from Croatian police officers. So there had been reports of that, but there had been no direct image. And here we could see the person, and then you could see behind them those officers. There's a whole analysis of their uniforms, and in particular, one of them has a handmade whip. And there is an interview of the person that was tortured, saying how they were whipped with that whip. Yes, but despite that, we're still being told by the Croatian government that none of this happened. And the EU Commission or Frontex are not much better and keep saying, if these reports are confirmed, we'll do something about it. And one might wonder what one needs to consider them confirmed. So in that context, how is law a tool of resistance? How can it be? First, I think the establishment of facts. So since 2019, there's been actually quite a few national courts that stopped transfers under Dublin to Croatia on the basis that these reports did prove that there were pushbacks from. So these national courts were in Switzerland, in Italy, and in Slovenia. And I think that's establishing the facts generally, but also if one litigated the pushback individually, which we support cases like that, then it's also establishment of the facts of one person. So instead of Croatia being able to say that people, migrants, whoever these are, anonymous migrants, are collectively lying, if you can establish pushbacks, the facts of individual pushbacks, that's in a way some sort of counter narrative. A second, I think to me, a second element of resistance is to counter the argument of illegal migration with the argument of illegal state action. Because those actions are illegal. So states have legal obligations under these different frameworks, and pushbacks do violate them because they're violent, because they stop access to asylum, and because they do not give access to an individual procedure. And I think it's important to underline that people are not illegal, but state actions are. And in fact, these unlawfulness of pushbacks is not just a consequence, it's actually their function. Their function is to get rid of asylum seekers and migrants quickly. And the violence is there to deter them from coming back. So that arbitrariness is constitutive and inherent, and it's the raison d'être of the pushbacks. And that brings me to the third point where I think law can be a tool of resistance, which is instead of having the migrant as an illegal object of the law, it serves maybe the litigation to show the migrant as a legal subject who has rights that they can claim. The downside of that is that, as I mentioned, the first case we supported had a negative decision. And I would say that it just, in a nutshell, the reason for that was that the applicants did not gain the empathy of the court, so that they couldn't just claim their rights in their full dignity. They had to sort of convince the court that their tale of misery was such that they should be given some sort of protection. And I would conclude by saying that, of course, it's not enough to do 1, 2, or 3 cases when you're going up against a system that is a tool of power and that is also racially biased. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. Again, so many interesting threads that are coming up around the status of evidence. What is the role of the Minor Act, the Minor Everyday Act, in line with legal resistance in different forms? What are the different iterations of resistance? How can we all find our lanes? So thank you so much. Our next paper is entitled Refounding Justice Amid National Violence and Disparities Towards a Declaration of Citizenship. And this paper is presented to us by Olga Demetriou and Jackie Stevens. So Olga Demetriou is a social anthropologist and associate professor in the School of Government and International Affairs at Durham University. She has worked on issues of citizenship as they relate to minorities, refugees, and IDPs in Greece and Cyprus. She has published Capricious Borders in 2013 and Refugeehood and the Post-Conflict Subject in 2018, as well as articles in the Journal of Ethnic and Migration Studies, Global Society, Journal of the Royal Anthropological Institute, and Ethnic and Racial Studies, among others. She is currently working on a project on activism in Mediterranean refugee reception sites. Jackie Stevens is a political science professor at Northwestern University and a Guggenheim recipient. Her work has appeared in American Political Science Review, Political Theory, and Third World Politics. She is the founding director of the Deportation Research Clinic in the Buffett Institute of Global Affairs. The clinic's research has been covered in the New York Times, the New Yorker, and NPR. The clinic works with a global network of lawyers, journalists, and those in removal proceedings to document government misconduct. Stevens's Law Review article analyzing the illegality of work by US residents held under immigration laws led to 9 class action lawsuits against private prisons in recent years. Excellent, okay. She lives in Chicago and New York City. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I think I'll start. So what we want to do in this short presentation is to introduce the Declaration of Citizenship project, which is a global initiative of scholars and activists to reformulate the relationships that bind people and communities. This arises from a critique of inequalities that perpetuate disparities in terms of longevity, resources, and political prerogatives. And here the Declaration of Citizenship offers a space for reimagining connections, communities, and freedoms that benefit the 99%. Now, instead of the abstract language of rights or top-down visions of a global government, our project mobilizes radical intuitions to reshape the rule of law towards this end. What we envision in the Declaration of Citizenship is something that promotes self-governance, consistent with the best of which our collective understandings and narratives are capable. So instead of compromises induced by nativism, militarism, and greed, we declare 5 principles for a citizenship that recognizes our embeddedness in overlapping webs of communities. This is the first principle. That implements freedoms to move and to associate and disassociate with sovereign powers. And here are principles 2 and 3. And where laws and policies are decided by those affected by them, the 4th principle, and are subject to permanent negotiations. That's principle 5. Now, the initial impetus of, as you've just heard, of the declaration actually arose from work that we have been each doing separately. Jackie on birthright citizenship and myself on borders and refugees. Now, these 2 lines of research converge on the understanding that the root problem lies with how citizenship is globally understood and operationalized so that it creates not only exclusions in the present, but perpetuates these through legacies of conflict and opposition. A key point here is the observation that it forms Jackie's research that since Greek antiquity, the vast majority of the planet's problems can be traced back to the rules creating and institutionalizing intergenerational communities and the legal families on which societies premise political membership. Insofar as laws create communities we access by and at birth, these communities seem natural. One problem with intergenerational communities is that they're grounds for mass systemic killing, such as, but not exclusive to war, as well as other less extreme uses of violence against those who are not, who are in other groups. Yet none of these groups is natural. They require numerous laws and administrative operations, laws for citizenship, naturalization, immigration, deportation, not to mention marriage and inheritance, create the existential identities behind the mass violence and inequality, including by how they're conducive to payouts tied to patronage associated with a range of what we can think of as clan loyalties that destroy commitments to good government and the rule of law. So in short, in the name of preserving intergenerational groups, governments are creating factions and then dividing land and peoples in ways that materialize harmful fantasies. Now, drawing from this premise, in 2012, Jackie founded the Deportation Research Clinic at Northwestern University. The clinic uses a public health approach to focus on two types of government misconduct. One is the US government detaining and deporting US citizens, and the second is the unlawful dollar per day wages paid to people in custody under immigration laws. Now, both of these topics highlight the hypocrisies of deportation. In the name of protecting US citizens, the government is detaining and deporting US citizens. In the name of protecting US jobs, the government is making contracts with US prison firms that are violating US labor and employment laws. The lessons from that work was not only about the inconsistencies of law, but also about the possibilities of intervention through class action. This provided the initial impulse for proposing a radical alternative to national attachment through the Declaration of Citizenship. Now, second impetus was an exemplar initiative we had discussed when we first met together in Cyprus in 2013 with Doush Derya, who at that point was a newly elected Cypriot MP. In the summer of that year, she had delivered a self-authored oath, and we hope to be putting that in the chat later on, in her inaugural presentation in the Turkish Cypriot Parliament, describing the country to which she was committed to serve, not as one of national borders, as the script she had been given described it, but as a peace-seeking, reunited, equality and fairness-oriented, discrimination-free polity of the future. Through this, she inspired a politics of performative action that went beyond her parliament. And I'll share another example later on. Recalling Doush's declaration, we have tried to imagine what a declaration of citizenship writ global might entail. And I'll pass over to Jackie now.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Olga, and thank you to the organizers for putting this together. It's been awesome. Yeah, I'm going to take up where Olga left off. Fanning out from Cyprus, Olga's research considers the walls and fences being put up and increasingly fortified to map the differentials of inequality across the Mediterranean. Ceuta, Melilla, Italy and Malta, Greece and Turkey, and most recently through the refortified Green Line between North and South Cyprus. All these barriers work in tandem with the privilege of buying one's mobility. At the offshores of Cyprus, Malta, and Gibraltar, mobility is bought through investment, residence, and citizenship, exactly because those borders place a premium on such mobility. Olga's work calls for transparency over the harms of this scheme to Cypriot shores, as passports were sold in exchange for luxury investments, often on the coasts, to question what it means to be a national of a state that sanctions corruption with impunity, and to bring together groups empowering citizens against corrupt governments today. Regimes of mobility entail careful calibrations of people, things, and money against global hierarchies of sovereign states along democratic continuums. These calibrations hinge on citizenship as birthright. Olga's recent work on refugee recognitions showed that peripheral states, such as in the Mediterranean, are valuable locations for exacting just the right amount of force, oppression, and death, both on their citizens and on non-citizens. Just enough for northern regimes to appear liberal and southern ones worse. And thus the premium on mobility can be maintained. In these spaces, past legacies of violence are intrinsic to citizenship regimes. These legacies provide the contours through which exclusions can be perpetuated at the same time as they are reinvented anew. This was clearly seen in Cyprus, where a binary citizenship maintains ethnic priorities and with it privileges that can in turn decide whether to care about keeping others out as proxy enemies or not to mind inviting them into a corruption breeding sharing of wealth. The Declaration has drawn, and there's a link to it that I put in the chat. The Declaration has drawn on these and other insights from colleagues working on Africa, the Americas, the Middle East, South Asia, and China to document citizenship harms and propose alternatives. It also draws on scholarship about how written constitutions persist and fail, especially research from the Comparative Constitution Project. And I'm just about to, there you guys go to see a link on that. Constitutional and other failures of governance inspire us to reimagine citizenship from the bottom up as an alternative to top-down models for lawmaking. Ours is an ongoing project into which people are welcome to both endorse and help shape further. And if you want to join us, you please go to the link, the declarationofcitizenship.org. Okay, I'm done.
Okay, so just to close, we'll be showing a very short clip to give you a sense of what we see as sort of these performative initiatives that remind us where borders lie, and also that that things don't end just with the removal of borders. It is that borders continue to exist elsewhere, but we need to remember that we want these borders not between us and others, but us and you. So what I'll be showing just now, I want you to concentrate on the second part of where the border is being replaced. So this is a new anti-government initiative in Cyprus, where a couple of months ago a wire fence was rolled out along the green line and was performatively cut and replaced outside the Ministry of Interior.
Vamos.
I'm hoping you can all hear.
Στεκόμαι εδώ και πάλι, πίσω μου έρχονται κι άλλοι. Σαν τα μυρμήγκια σκάψαμε τούτο το κανάλι. Σ' αυτήν εδώ τη βούβα, Μεσόγειος να κούβα. Καράβια πάνε και έρχονται απ' το καιρό του Ιούδα. Σύνορο λέει μυρίζει, τυχή Ευρώπη χτίζει. Μα η Μεσόγειος μας ενώνει και δεν μας χωρίζει. Μοσχοβόλα το βράδυ, σκορδό μαζί και λάδι. Και ένα κλονί βασιλικό τεινάζει στο σκοτάδι. Αλγερί και Σεβίγια, άλλα λιμάνια κίδια. Κι ύστερα πάλι Βηρητό, Περαία και Μαρσίδια. Και ακού και τα νέα, το έθνος και η σημαία. Φαντασιακές κατασκευές είναι και φευγαλαία.
Αγαπησούσα τα σύνορα, έτσι κι αλλιώς είναι εφήμερα. Μαζί κι αυτούς που τα ορίζουν, ανθρώπους χωρίζουν, τα νέα μου γυρίζουν. Los pájaros y las flores fronteras ni llevan banderas. Πάντα μισούσα τα σύνορα. Έτσι κι αλλιώς είναι εφήμερα. Μαζί κι αυτούς που τα ορίζουν, ανθρώπους χωρίζουν, τα τέρα μου γυρίζουν. Los pájaros y las flores son de todos los colores y cruzan libres las tierras, no tienen fronteras ni llevan banderas. Vamos.
Right. Oops. Thank you. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So this was it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And Olga, thank you, Olga, also for doing the English transcriptions.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you all. I want to thank all of our panelists for your wonderful interventions and papers. I also want to encourage everyone who's in the audience to please feel free to post more questions through the Q&A function, which you can find on the bottom right corner of your Zoom window. I'll just start with a couple of observations, some themes that are threading through the different papers that we've been offered today. So one is about something about facts, or what is the status of knowledge in terms of building change. And so I feel like with Jackie and Olga's presentation, as well as Hanaa's, that what is the status of evidence, right? So Hanaa talks a little bit about facts and awareness is not sufficient on its own, right, to create actual change. And yet there's still this real importance around legal activism when it comes to migration justice, that we need to establish the facts. And then also in a larger context and condition in which bringing the receipts and trying to prove what's already been proven over and over and over again. And so I'm just wondering, how do we go from establishing facts and bringing those receipts, and then actually making not just policy change, but also changes in imagination, changes in the way that we understand the root causes of the problems of that are seen in migration politics, which are actually more rooted in conditions of colonialism, extractive capitalism, et cetera. And I think there's some of that comes through in Olga and Jackie's paper as well, right? So on the one hand, there's this effort to expose the contradictions of, for example, the US's inconsistency in its legal approach to migrants. So the fact that they are saying that migrants are at the root of labor politics, and the fact that US citizens can't get jobs, whereas they actually pay migrants $1 a day when they're under detention, things like this. And I also, this is just a larger question, but I wanted to get a better sense, and I will look at the website in a moment, but I want to get a sense of, what does the citizenship from the bottom up look like, right? I'm really super fascinated by this idea, and I'm wondering if, what is the advantage, or what is calling it citizenship rather than something else like a community or something else, right? What does calling it citizenship do for that bottom up envisioning? And I also want to think about how that articulates to questions of space, which kind of brings me to Caroline's paper. I really love how you're kind of opening up the way we're thinking about relationships across vast expanses of space, large geographic scales, and your insistence that we not only think about migration through displacement, but also thinking about migration in terms of emplacement, right? And then I think your insistence that we also broaden our temporal frames is also really important. So not just thinking about the event, but about how community, how activism unfolds over a space of time. And I think this gets back to another kind of theme that runs through the papers, which is like, what are the many ways in which advocates, but also directly affected people, how do we kind of jump in and find a lane and try to make the changes that are so necessary as we get further and further into a kind of colonization crisis? So I think that Erika and Ryan raise up the everyday resistance, the small acts that build up, the different kinds of coalitions, so that no one is actually just creating migrant justice movements on their own, but it's like finding what else is in motion. Who are our potential allies? Who do we build coalitions with against like an oppressive regime, and to imagine something else that comes after it. So I think this comes through in kind of all of the papers, really. But everyone's looking at kind of different inflections of that kind of organizing and coalition building and moving towards something else than that terrible and oppressive system that we have today. So those are just some of my kind of thoughts in just listening to your papers right now. I also want to give you some space to ask each other questions, and then we'll move into the audience Q&A. So if any of our panelists have questions for each other or any comments for each other, you have that space now, and then I'll start moving to the audience questions.
How do you propose that we respond to the questions?
I'll just open it up if people have any kind of immediate thoughts or responses to anything that I just said or to things that you heard through the other papers. I can call on people, but I usually prefer to let people have their thoughts emerge as they come forward.
Well, I'll respond if that's okay. So I wanted to first respond to your question about the problem of documentation and how to address that. And I just am going to share a link here to an edited collection that's called Citizenship in Question, Evidentiary Birthright and Statelessness. And this is a collection I co-edited that came out a few years ago, and it's available as a PDF for no cost because the rights were bought by Knowledge Unlatched. So if you want, you can take a look at that. And the argument that we make is, this is a book I co-authored with Benjamin Lawrence. And the argument is that instead of trying to catch up with these ridiculous requirements of documentation, and this actually is comments that are engaged with the work of all of the other people on this panel, instead of trying to catch up with these regimes of documentation, what we do is infer from these different requirements and the impossibility of fulfilling them that we should really be questioning the idea of citizenship and birthright citizenship on which that is based. And so instead of trying to produce evidence to appease the authorities, use these kinds of impossible to fulfill requirements as evidence that the whole regime is bankrupt. And so the essays are from Ivory Coast and Taiwan, and they're based on experiences of claims or requirements of documentation, both to prove citizenship and to prove statelessness, that are impossible to fulfill in these different contexts. And then so briefly to your second question about citizenship from the bottom up, I hope it's okay if I read from the preamble that this group put together. And it says, "We the people do warrant that existing sovereign projects have wrought devastation to our lives and habitats, capitulating to those motivated by greed and the lust for power. Governments variously constituted have inflicted injustice. Operating to the advantage of a few at the expense of the people's health, longevity, and collective wisdom, sovereigns have taken to themselves prerogatives vested solely in we, the citizens. We declare as citizens, regardless of place of birth, ancestry, status, creed, or condition, the prerogative for instruments of self-governance dedicated to our collective flourishing and the avoidance of harm." And there's a couple of other sentences I won't read now, but the idea is that rather than abdicate expectations of fairness and self-rule to hierarchical authorities and have this idea of like the people on the one hand and then the government on the other, that we say, okay, well, we want to be able to set rules among ourselves, but we want to make sure that they're informed by certain kinds of principles. And so that's what this project is about. And Olga, you can, or others people can add, but that's, I guess, my first cut at responding to your thoughtful questions. Thank you.
Yeah, I guess just to pick up on that and to sort of phrase my own question to Hanaa on the back of that. I think, yeah, that for me, that shift that Hanaa was talking about from the migrant as a legal object to the migrant as legal subject is really important. And it goes back to this idea of shifting the border. So there is a border, there is a battle to fight, and there is a sort of confrontation taking place. And I think it's important to keep remembering that when we're talking about dismantling borders, because that's only half of the story. And I guess my question, thinking about pushbacks, which I remember people talking about pushbacks in Nevros on the Greek-Turkish border since the early 2000s. And again, that problem there was documentation. And I think that speaks well to what Jackie was just saying, that you then perhaps you need to shift the question rather than respond to what the process is telling you to do. And on the back of that, I wanted to ask whether, Hanaa, you can go back to what you were saying about the European Court of Human Rights case on Melilla and how that kind of went wrong, I guess, because I would love to hear a bit more about that. Thanks.
Yeah, if that's okay, I'll do that.
Can I pose two more audience questions for you in addition to tag on to Olga's?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so Kendra Cornelius asks two questions. One, have you seen any positive trends in policy in countries that you have had cases brought against them regarding illegal pushbacks? And two, have you seen this kind of outright denial of illegal behavior by the state present in other types of state practice, such as detention and deportation?
Maybe I'll just start with the last question. I think with detention and deportation, because when they're given a very specific legal framework, so I mean, I'm a lawyer, so, you know, I work with the law. I apologize. It's not very imaginative and not very liberating either. Anyway, I think, you know, when there's a specific legal framework, I mean, there may be, of course, in a legal process, the other side is always going to try to deny responsibility for whatever it is that you cannot prove. That's just how the legal process works. But I guess when detention and deportation are done officially, the issue is not about denying. And I think pushbacks are particular because they're a bit, I mean, we tend to compare them to some extent to enforced disappearances or to unlawful killings. They're happening outside of that legal framework. I mean, they should be deportations. If you wanted to take the state side, that's what they should be doing. They should be doing paperwork to deport people if they think that they can deport them. But that's why actually pushback is not a legal term, because it cannot be a legal process. It's exactly what happens outside of the law. And coming back on the issue of border resistance, I mean, I didn't have time because my presentation was too long for the time that I had. But what I wanted to start saying is, I don't see what we do particularly as resistance. I was just putting the question. I think those who resist are those at the border, and they resist by their movement and their presence to a globally unjust and neo-colonial migration system, which would want to deny them the right to move, but they move. And I think that should be said, that they're the first ones to resist, and that their act is resistance. And the pushback is actually just a continuation of that oppressive system. The other actors resisting are, of course, the activists and journalists on the ground that support them and gather the evidence, even though they're being really persecuted by the states. For the case of Melilla, so that was the first case we supported of two people that were pushed back at the border, and the court accepted. So I have to say we won at first instance. And our ground was that the deportation was against the prohibition of collective expulsions, which is part of the European Convention of Human Rights, and which basically says, if you're going to expel people, you cannot do it collectively, and you need to have to examine the individual circumstances, which obviously in pushbacks doesn't happen. They just take everyone, often without even identifying them, not having any idea who's in there, where they come from, what their story is, and just push them back into the border. On the other side. And I say back, but sometimes it's not even back, just pushing people from wherever they didn't come from. And so there, what the Grain Chamber did, and it was an unanimous decision, was saying, yes, the law applies at the border. Yes, it was collective, and yes, it was an expulsion. But because they used force as a group to enter, it's their fault that they weren't, so they didn't play by the rules. They didn't go to the border crossing to ask for protection. So because they didn't play by the rules, it's their fault. So we're gonna strip them off the protection of the law. And an argument that was made on our side and by UNHCR and by the Commissioner for Human Rights of the Council of Europe was that they couldn't have gone to the border crossing because of racial profiling. And the court said that may be true, but it's not Spain's fault. So we're not gonna count it. So the decision was really criticized, and so I don't, if you're interested, you can find a number of blog posts that criticize it. I think the bottom line to me is, I don't really understand how 17 judges of the highest court on human rights signed on this. But I think at the end, it's because the applicants didn't have a strong enough tale of misery. And they came to claim their rights as not as an act of compassion towards the judges, but just to claim their rights. And it shows that, it's not only true of migrants, it's also true of, for example, poor people. Unless you kind of show that, it would be immoral to not give you your rights, then you lose, because law is a tool for the more powerful. And it is sad, but it is true. Yes, I hope that answers your question, Olga. And for the last question of whether we've seen any positive change, I don't know if it's positive, but before the NDNNT case in 2012, there had been the case of Hirsi Jama that had found that when Italy sent vessels in the high seas and took people back to the Libyan authorities, they were still violating the European Convention on Human Rights. Of course, Italy stopped doing that, but the change was that they started telling Libyan coast guards to just go and get people. So I'm not sure that can be described as a positive change. But that's the point. Litigation on its own cannot bring change. It has to be alongside social movements and political movements, but it's just one of the tools available that one might choose to use.
Thank you so much for that. I'm going to start moving or give more emphasis to our audience questions, because they're really good, and I think they follow up on a lot of what has already been raised here. So Jean-Pierre Casarino asks that, he has a kind of a long question. I'll put it in the chat as well so you can see it. He says, today's webinar is about resistance and alternatives. My take is that we can no longer wallow in the denunciation of violence and injustice. Past experiences of resistance have shown that the mere disclosure of tragic facts may lead to no action, or worse, to the paradoxical acceptance of things as they are. Denouncing immoral acts and injustice is crucial, but this will never ever suffice to tackle the real problem. Action would be more effective by having the authoritativeness to publicly question the utility of offshore processing centers, pushbacks, detention, etc., while putting decision makers in this situation to publicly justify their policy options. I feel like he's kind of wrapping together a lot of the points that were raised today. So his question is, has this ever been undertaken? What is your take? Thank you. So again, like, how do we go from bringing the receipts of things that are already well known to be immoral, illegal, unjust, and how do we actually create that into change? He is claiming for the authoritativeness to publicly question the utility of all these harmful systems. But first, has this ever been taken, and what is your take? I'll also put this in the chat.
Shall I have a go? I'm not sure if it was mentioned. I used to work in Australian immigration detention centres in mental health. So I think I can speak with a little bit of authority about the impact of the centres. And we've had people in Australia, paediatricians, professors who visited the centres when they can get in, all speak out about, you know, these centres and the damage they do in Australia. But as you probably saw in our presentation with those quotes, the Australian government just doesn't care. And they have no real incentive to change without that sort of public support. At the moment, I mean, most Australians still support these policies. So as I see it, it's starting to think more in terms of costs. How can we make the system unsustainable for the Australian government? I mean, we need evidence, we need facts. You know, what Hanaa was saying about lawyers have been so effective in Australia as well, but supported by movements. So I think we need to start thinking in how we can make this unsustainable in the Australian situation anyway.
I mean, if I can just follow up on what Dr. Essex was just describing, I think that a big problem is that, as he mentioned, it's not that the government wants these policies and majorities oppose them, right? So the problem is us, right? The problem is that the consciousness of most citizens is very deferential to these kinds of horrible practices, so that as the question is posing, people aren't appalled. They're like, oh yeah, good. Like, these people shouldn't be here. Treat them like crap. That's okay. And so, there's different ways of responding to that. And one is to just, kind of try to throw monkey wrenches into the system and make it more costly through the use of different kinds of expert knowledge. So that's something on which we work. And another way to try to get at this is to try to reshape concretely what our citizenship looks like. So the project that we're working on is not just to come up with an abstract declaration, but to mobilize it through having it be endorsed through different government agents and bodies. So from city councils to larger bodies, to engage people across the world with implementing these principles to, again, from the bottom up, change what citizenship looks like.
Can I add a little bit? I think both of those are really important answers. What this question immediately made me think of in terms of trying to formulate an answer is, what is the utility, right? Like, if the idea is to push back or publicly question the utility, what is the idea behind having detention centers and pushbacks? And I think that in the case of the United States, we see it as part of a coordinated effort at deterring migrants from coming to the United States, right? Obligatory detention comes in tandem with a host of other policies. And so I think that, and I also think that at the same time, every time, or rather, when efforts have been made to have alternatives to detention, they've been rescinded, right? Like very famously, Trump calling it catch and release, when these alternatives to detention are much less costly and have staggeringly high rates of people still making their court dates and this kind of thing. And I think that your points that in general citizenry of the United States is in some way in favor of these policies for their punitiveness is an important one. And I think that one of the sort of theoretical aspects of that is the way that crossing the border not at a port of entry has been made into a crime in the United States, right? That I think it's really important to remember that this is actually a new thing, right? That this happened in the 20th century, that it did not used to be a crime to cross the border in the United States. And it's really interesting to see right now the way that this is getting sort of like grafted onto Mexico, where it's still just an administrative, like a lack of an administrative process if you've crossed the border. But because largely of US pressure, right, there's starting to be a detention apparatus, and there's starting to be laws that enable and enforce detention and deportation. And I think so that it's a place where you can see like how does the mindset around migration change to become criminalized. And I think that part of the work of disclosing facts and disclosing history is undoing the idea that migration is a crime, because I do think that that sort of like theoretical background of how we perceive migration is really important in the way that the country still continues to desire punishing migrants.
Yeah, thank you so much for all of that. And I think there's a number of ways that FAFSA can be deployed. And I'm kind of going to co-sign to what Caroline just said, that part of the work of history and bringing the receipts is to denaturalize what has already been so normalized into our consciousness. So one of the ways that I think about it, not necessarily around immigration, but more broadly in terms of punitive systems more broadly, is to part of the work of imagining what comes after these oppressive systems. Part of that work has to be to get the cop out of our head, right? To get the detention kind of mindset, the deportation mindset, the idea that borders are, well, of course we have to have borders. Actually, we don't. And that bordering, that we have long genealogies of welcoming the stranger, welcoming our neighbor, that are just as long as any kind of genealogies of bordering or keeping people out or things like this. I think that this question and all of your responses actually riff on another question that was raised by Monami Malik, and I also co-sign on this question. She says that supporting the leadership and organizing led by refugees, longtime and new, and migrant communities is critical to lend allyship to non-directly affected communities, advocates, and activists. So what about the existence of growth and support for refugee and migrant-led organizing? In the United States, this is a long-time understanding in terms of immigrant-led movements, including returning migrants, workers, women, self-organized networks, et cetera, to guide approaches to advocacy, policy, actions, and alliance building. So this question is about what happens when we center the leadership of people who are directly affected in the work that's led by people who may or may not be directly affected. So more like advocates, activists, lawyers, things like that. How does this shake out, or how does this fare in Europe, Australia, and elsewhere? So thinking about migrant-led communities, I think this actually goes into some of the comments that you were just saying about reshaping what citizenship looks like. It would be a little odd to think about that question without directly affected communities as being a central part of that conversation, et cetera. So I'll just open it up. It's not directed to anyone, so I'll just open it up to everyone.
Maybe I'll just briefly comment on that by saying that ideally, in our sort of supporting litigation model, of course, we want to be able to support existing social movements. I think one of the reasons why there's so little pushback litigation is, well, there are two reasons, maybe three. I mean, aside from the evidence thing, first, it's a moving population. So the organizing, like it's, you know, in 6 months, you'll have a completely different set of people. It constantly changes. So at that border, so it's difficult, I think, to organize a political movement like we understand, or a social movement like we understand. And this is why I was saying resistance comes from movement. What is organized is to get through. And in that sense, they're extremely political because they don't, you know, like people at the border do not accept the border. I mean, the border's there, it's a reality for them. It's a really sore reality. They get beaten up, they feel it in their body, in their lives, but they don't accept the idea that they cannot move, they will move. So I think that in itself is, you know, it is social and political organizing. And it's of the greatest impact, I would say, in questioning the idea of the border and in questioning that policy. Once they arrive, they're really tired and they have to face whatever other oppressive system awaits them where they arrive. So at that point, I would say what we've seen with the people that we've been following is that many of them just want to leave it behind them because they need to focus on their own survival. So I think in an ideal, I mean, I always think you can't put that burden on people and tell them that they should now organize politically, because actually their political struggle is to survive and make a life for themselves. Now, some of them, the exceptional ones, I guess, of course, there are migrant and refugees movements in Europe, but I would even question that title, because I would think, I mean, in the European post-colonial system, the lines of citizenship, who's a migrant, who's a refugee, and who's a citizen, don't make much sense, because in the end, we're all former colonial subjects. Some of us acquired citizenship and others didn't. But it's just, you know, we're from the same, I mean, my father was born a colonial subject. At some point, he was a migrant. Now he's a citizen. Half of my family is going to be a citizen. The other half is going to be, some of them will be crossing with visas, others will be crossing in an unauthorized way. So, yeah, I never really know what to answer when I'm, you know, yeah. I think we should be mindful of that when we speak about refugee and migrant movements, social movements and social organizing.
I think your comments also kind of encourage us to think much more capaciously about what counts as resistance, what counts as agency, and what counts as organizing. Because I'm completely on board with you when you say that, you know, the very fact that you're moving, the very fact that you're surviving in a context and under conditions which are designed to prevent all of that from happening itself is a form of agency. It is a form of resistance, even if it's non-conscious or non-willful in the kind of way that we valorize in terms of looking at social movements, but it is absolutely part of the social movement. Do other people have thoughts on this question about migrant-led organizing?
I think I would like to pick up on what Hanaa said from a different angle, in the sense of remembering also this idea of community and the fact of identities that are shifting and fluid and sort of, and the fact also that communities are about belonging, but also about the right to choose not to belong. So that's why one of the principles that we spent a lot of time discussing actually was this idea of people moving out of their communities and of, you know, whatever it is that we imagine as communities that should be. And I think that is as fundamental to recognizing that people move into communities. So the idea of moving out and the idea of disassociating with something, I think should belong to the political subject.
Okay, thank you so much. I think we have time for maybe one more question. I'm sort of going to combine two questions that are directed at Caroline and Erika and Ryan, but I think that anyone can jump in on this. And it's a question about method and collaboration. So, so for Caroline, there's some questions about what are some of the methodological and ethical challenges that you came across in your research in Mexico and how you navigate those. And then to Erika and Ryan, and again, these are for, I think are for everybody, is what is your position as researchers and advocates or activists on collaborations with state authorities to push for humane alternatives to detention? So I think this is kind of about the ethics of research, and like if we work with people in the state that we're trying to oppose, whose policies we're trying to oppose, and also working with directly impacted communities both. And it sounds like there's some questions about the transnational nature of your research as well. So they're directed to Caroline, Erika, and Ryan, but I do think that they apply to more broadly to all of the panelists.
I can start off quickly. I think that method and ethics and the way that they interact are definitely something I think about a lot. And I think that the biggest challenge for me in conducting ethnography, in using participant observation as a method. So, I spent a lot of time volunteering, helping people navigate bureaucratic processes in Mexico with a couple of different organizations that work with deportees and returned migrants. And so the biggest challenge for me is setting sort of the line of where am I accompanying you to go to the civil registry and where am I a researcher. And so I think that having sort of consent conversations at various different moments is a really key part of it. And I think another thing that I've come to as a method, or like an ethical method, is that I think that contacting people after the fact and saying like, hey, I would like to describe this situation or this conversation, you know, you'll be anonymized, but I just want to make sure that that's okay with you, because in the moment, right, if you spend several days with someone, it's, you know, even if you've told them I'm writing a dissertation, it doesn't always, it's not always in the forefront of people's minds, right? And so I think that sort of having this like recursive consent has become a powerful tool for me, and one that I find really sort of relevant to the work more so than the type of protocols that are outlined in IRB. I think, yeah, that's been sort of one of the main ethical conclusions I've come to.
Yeah, and if I can come on in this, like more in the second part of the question, I would say that part of our work as researchers is, as was discussed, I think, here in this panel, is to document and gather facts. And I think we should be looking into maybe questions that authorities or governments are maybe not trying to hide, but they're really not interested in exploring or looking, for example, the impact of their policies, the impact of detention, or looking into and gathering evidence about how, you know, alternatives could be working, like community solutions instead of, you know, detention, letting people live in the community. Letting people to live in the community and with dignity, and showing that this could actually be more favorable to the migrants or asylum seekers, but also, as Ryan mentioned, maybe even more cost effective for the government. So I think as researchers, we should be looking into the impact of the policies, but also the alternatives, which maybe the leadership or leaders are not so willing to explore.
Can I just quickly come in? This will be the last thing I say, because I think it's a fascinating question, a really interesting one. It's something I've thought about a great deal, you know, with the government, that sort of idealistic, realistic sort of solution thing. And I think we need to articulate alternatives. We need to agitate. We need to have new and better systems and disrupt current, you know, systems where we can, and ultimately argue for the abolition of immigration, detention, and borders. But in saying that, you know, at least the situation in Australia, the conditions under which people are held, if we can get immediate gains through cooperation, I think we'd be silly to turn that down. Sure, there are ethical compromises there, but I think we need to be pragmatic first and foremost with all of this, while keeping, you know, keeping in mind who our enemies are, if I could phrase it like that. We're keeping in mind our broader aims, essentially. So thank you.
Okay, I want to thank all of our panelists so much for your interventions today and for being in conversation. I want to thank all of the participants, as well as the conference organizers and all of the invisible labor that it takes to put on an entirely Zoom conference. The logistics are, I can't even imagine. So thank you everyone who has made this today and the whole conference possible. Just as a closing note, I think on this last question, I think what some of you are saying kind of jives with abolitionist thinking, that in order to change the world that we live in, for migrant justice requires changing everything, and changing everything requires a million little experiments, and that not everything is going to work, but we all need to like find the different means by which we can take the bordered, militarized, terrible world and turn it into something else. And so thank you all so much again. And thank you to all the conference organizers.
Thank you so much. That was such a fantastic panel and a really beautiful way to end the week. And thank you so much, Dr. Paik, for moderating and leading the discussion today. It was really an honor to have you. And if anyone who has not yet engaged with her work on abolitionism and migration through Radical Sanctuary, I really recommend it. And thank you to the panelists for giving us a glimpse into the really important work you do and for sharing all the sources and links. We really appreciate it. And I know I'm entering this next phase of thesis writing and work to follow this week feeling really inspired, and I'm just very grateful to have been introduced to such fantastic work throughout the week, and especially today. And I'm also really looking forward to reading any potential collaborations that come from the conference connections, and it's been really wonderful to witness the discussions take place over the course of the week, and I hope these conversations continue. Huge thank you to everyone for engaging and sharing your time with us, not only today, but for the past week. I'm really grateful that we were able to connect on such an international sphere, and albeit virtually. And another huge thank you to our co-hosts and to our entire OMSS team for all of your work to make this conference happen. If you have enjoyed the conference, please consider making a donation, which can be done through purchasing a donation ticket on our Eventbrite page. Your donations will be split among 5 organizations that have all contributed to the conference week: Otros Ritmos en Acción, Border Violence Monitoring Network, State Watch, Oxford Against Immigration Detention, and Art Connects. Do remember that the conference special issue is available on the Routed website if you've not already had a look, and any conference recordings will be available on the Border Criminology's YouTube account shortly after. Thank you so much, and please take care. I really hope we get to connect again soon. Bye-bye.